All right. Just find my agenda again here. So, I'm going to call the meeting to order. I'll lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance this morning, since I haven't done it for a while.
Looking at the screen.
Yes. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great, thank you. Okay, has the agenda been posted?
It has, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Nadia, can we have the roll call, please?
Commissioners Adams,
Present.
Altman excused, Presley,
Present.
Budigo,
Present.
Burke,
Present.
Clarkson, Corcoran,
Present.
Dada excused, Feldman,
Present.
Freeman, Hedrick,
Here.
Hearn,
Here.
Hughes excused, Pattison,
Here.
Hyde, Reason,
Here.
Schmitz,
Here.
Suero, Jones.
Here. Very good. Do we have, acceptance of the agenda. Have you had a chance to look at the agenda? Any questions? Move adoption?
So moved.
No changes? Okay. Public comments. I don't know that we have any, do we? We have no public comments, so we'll move to approval of the Airport Commission meeting of December the 11th. You've all had a chance to read the minutes, I hope. Are there any additions, corrections?
Move to approve. Second.
First and second, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Very good. All right. Moving now to the chairman's report would be mine. First of all, Happy New Year to everybody. Hopefully this will be a good year. Oops. It'll be a good year for everyone. Certainly going to be a good year, I think, for the airport as we move forward on our capital projects.
It is going to be very
It's going to be an exciting year, as a
Absolutely.
matter of fact. So we have remaining two that have not had a chance. Bill, you just, where did you, Bill, pass?
Yeah.
There you are, I knew you had just signed. We're going to start with Paul. As been our custom, we have two final commissioners who haven't had a chance to introduce themselves with the background and experience to the commission. And this will complete our entire list. And then I'm going to come up with another exercise next week, or next month, that I'll tell you about later. So, if we can start with Paul, a 3 to 4 minute kind of background and summary, and then also we'll move to you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Al. My name is Paul Badillo. I'm the appointed representative on the Airport Commission from Indian Wells. I'm replacing Robert Berman, who served on the commission very well for the past 2 terms until he termed out. I've been a resident of Indian Wells since about 2013. It's a little bit of an older community. People ask me how I like retirement. I still work. And so I do volunteer work such as with this commission as well as some other volunteer work. I have a degree in finance. My professional career for 35 years I've been in healthcare, rising up to executive leadership positions. Currently I'm the CEO of one of the largest health information providers in the state of California. I've got extensive experience working with state, federal, and government agencies and affairs. I travel a lot back and forth between Sacramento and Washington as well, so it's good to have the airport here locally. Looking forward to when Southwest comes here. It'll be a little easier trip back and forth, so I'm probably the biggest champion about that. When in Washington and Sacramento, what I do primarily is I work on regulation for healthcare information, making sure that safety is in effect for patients that are working, they're seeing patients throughout the state of California as well. I've worked with many federal and state grants. I've probably had 85% of the grants approved that I've applied for. Probably totaling $75 million over the past 10 years. Volunteer work. I'm on the board of trustees of the Ukrainian Culture Center. When I married my wife, she didn't know what the Ukraine was. Unfortunately, in the news, everybody now knows what Ukraine is. So, that organization's been in existence since 1944. I'm on the board of trustees for that. The board of trustees of the Ukrainian Arts Center, also the U.S. National Holodomor Committee. I was working on a committee, we were instrumental in getting a new monument up in Washington DC recently. It is the newest monument that is in the city of monuments, as we call it. There's so many monuments up there. That required not only to procure tens of millions of dollars of funding, but we had to work with various congressmen and senators to get their support and approval for the project. So that's really the forte that I've got, being able to get those relationships and have those relationships in place. In the volunteer work that I also do, I meet with, I've met recently with the presidents of the Baltic nations, defense ministers, because of what's happening in Ukraine on the sideline. I was asked to be appointed honorary consul for the country of Ukraine. I denied that, didn't want to do that, I'm too busy with everything else I do. I was very surprised when I was appointed the commissioner representing Indian Wells on this commission, because of the fact that my experience in airports is limited. However, because of the strong regulatory as well as the governmental experience that I have, the city felt that I would be a good fit and bring something different to the organization. So I do have extensive experience in strategic planning and budgeting as well in the various organizations that I've worked with. So it's a pleasure to work with all of you. I know we've been working together for the past 6 months, and I've enjoyed getting to know all of you, as well as bringing the backgrounds that all of you have into this commission. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Bill.
Good.
Thank you, very good. Bill?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Bill Pattison. I'm the city manager for the city of Coachella. I was appointed to this. I believe our former city manager was appointed to the commission before. My background is I was a CPA. I went to school at Cal State San Bernardino, got my bachelor's and master's degrees there. Worked for a local CPA firm in San Bernardino for about 5 or 6 years. Worked in local government, auditing local government, so that got me interested in local government accounting. Started my career in Temecula as a senior accountant, went to Hemet and became a finance director very young. I enjoy that. My background in auditing really helped me there. It's tough to find good help these days, and I'm sure the city manager for Palm Springs can allude to that. We're in the midst of trying to find a finance director now, because right now I'm wearing both hats there. Other than that, I've been city manager now for about 3 years. My background is budgeting and, like I said, finance director there. I hope that I add a little to something, to this group, being able to help with the budget. And I find it interesting. I've never dealt with airport operations before. However, I did audit when I was with the CPA firm in San Bernardino, the airport authority there. So I do have some background with transition from a government agency, the Norton Air Force Base, there to a private agency. So that's all there is about me.
Well, that's great.
All of your backgrounds are vast and diverse, and I find it very interesting, this group of people coming together to help the community in the valley. And out on the east end, we're very different than over here. But hopefully I can take a little of what I get here and add it to over there. Hopefully at some point we can do something with the Tunnel Airport. It's what ultimately Coachella hopes for. So.
That's great.
Thank you.
Very helpful.
Mr. Chairman, I just note that Bill is doing a great job with Coachella.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's always a place for you at City Hall here.
Thank you.
You coach people off-site.
Yeah, the connections we can make. Moving on, in terms of my report here, just to let you know, the Operations Committee met yesterday. Jan chairs that, and he will be making a presentation under the Commissioner reports on the agenda about that outcome. And then the Marketing Committee is meeting immediately after this morning's Commission meeting. Let's see, what else did I want to make a mention of? I guess when we get to the City Manager's report, David, I mean, there are a number of things, the changes in the City Council meeting schedule. Does that have an effect on us in terms of our meeting? About the commission appointment, I guess Jeff Kors is raising the question on there, and any other items that would be effective. So I'm sure that was on your report agenda, but in case it wasn't, just, all right, great. Just as a reminder about our conversations when we have it, so that people aren't going crazy. If you want to be recognized, just raise your hand and I keep a list and just go by in order so nobody's going crazy jumping over people. And I would continue to ask, as we've been doing, when one point has been made, that we don't make it 14 times. We add to the conversation And that will help us keep moving along in our meetings. I think that is all I had. That is what I had. So we move next to introductions and presentations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate everybody's time today. This is going to be a very exciting presentation, and it has to do with their service, what PSP's been doing over the last year and where it's going to be in the next year, half a year. But Bob, from the CVB, why don't you explain our guest and why he's here and the relation to the CVB, just to make that distinction, please.
Good morning, everyone.
If you can stand up, please.
Good morning, everyone. So over the past few years, the CVB has been working with the airport on developing new air service and doing the things the airport can't do. And through this, we developed a relationship with Avion Pacific, who is our actual route development company that we work with. So Oliver's here, and he's the one who's been working on our behalf with all the airline relationships to help determine what flights are viable, putting together the marketing kits, going out and meeting with the airlines, and then hopefully getting them to create flights that fly here.
Yeah, I'd like to add that the reason the airport does not financially participate anymore is because the CVB is very active in revenue guarantees to airlines. And the FAA prohibits us as an airport to be discretionary in doing revenue guarantees. We've got to offer what we offer to everyone. The CVB, on the other hand, being a separate entity, using the expertise of Oliver, and we've sat in presentations to airlines, but they can actually focus in on specific routes, specific airlines, and not be subject to the federal rules on that. So, with that being said, Oliver, the floor is yours. We don't have a lot to talk about today, so take your time.
Does everybody know who Oliver is?
I think you just introduced him.
Okay.
Yeah, do you
Just
want
want to be
say
sure.
anything
Anybody
more?
have any
Oliver,
questions
give
about
him
that? All right.
a little background if you
All
think.
right.
Yeah.
May I take a clicker?
You may have the clicker.
Thank you
Not-
very much.
Yes.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's an honour to finally get to present to the Airport Commission. We spend a lot of time working directly with the CVB, which is a wonderful organisation and really a bit of a masterstroke in my mind in terms of how West Valley can coordinate the 9 different cities together in building up an air service portfolio. But it's also a pleasure to be here to speak to the Commission because we work very closely with PSB. We think this is a fantastic airport. You guys have done wonderful things for your airlines. Airlines are wax lyrical about how efficient this airport is, how cost efficient this airport is, and how much they enjoy flying here. So to be able to represent both a wonderful destination and a wonderful airport makes my life an absolute joy. I first came to Palm Springs in the Valley 10 years ago, fell in love with it, and it's been a dream of mine for many, many years to actually be able to support you in your air service portfolio. A little bit of background about our company. We've been in existence since 2009. We work for 45 airports and destinations around the world, from big airports such as Las Vegas and Vancouver, through to quite small airports, sometimes even EAS airports. So Palm Springs sits right in the middle of all those. We also have a bit of a bent towards destination type markets, so we work for markets such as Hawaii and Las Vegas. So we like working with markets that have a great story to sell and have a great future in terms of growth potential. So as you see in our presentation today, we'll go through a lot of numbers and figures and statistics. That's based because a lot of the times when we're talking with airlines, it is a very numerical based approach in their decision making these days. But if there's anything that I say that doesn't necessarily make sense or my accent is too thick, please stop me and we can go through these in greater detail. So with that, and I welcome questions. By no means do I want this to be a lecture. This is something I really want the Commission to be fully aware of, fully engaged in, as well as members of the public. So a lot of people talk about air service in Palm Springs because it's such a high profile thing. You have a wonderful airport based in the middle of downtown Palm Springs, which is a phenomenal asset. One of the longest runways in Southern California, which is something which a lot of Southern California airports can't ask for. And the other thing that's incredibly rare in Southern California is you're an airport with room to grow. And when I say room to grow, I don't mean physical room to grow. I mean room to grow in terms of accommodating more airlines and more flights. It's a very rare thing in Southern California and something which Palm Springs is going to be, that commodity has become more and more valuable in Palm Springs in the years to come. So if you have a look at what's happened in terms of capacity at Palm Springs, you can see here that ever since 2015 you've been on this upward growth trajectory in terms of airport capacity. That's an incredible growth rate at 8.2% per year. When you think about generally speaking, the growth rate you expect is roughly in line with economic growth. Palm Springs has been growing at 2 to 3 times US economic growth over the last 5 years. That's a remarkable achievement for this airport, and goes to show not only what a great destination this is and how appealing it is to a lot of people both around the country and around the world, but also just how well this airport has done in accommodating that growth. So you can see there that we're not hitting growth constraints. We're not seeing situations whereby it was growing steadily and then it flattened out. This is a great story of Palm Springs, great destination with an airport facility that supports that growth. In 2019, we saw 10% growth versus 2018. So the growth actually accelerated in 2019. Usually you expect the reverse. As the airport gets bigger and bigger, that growth rate's going to come down. But in fact, in 2019, it actually accelerated. So capacity is going up at record levels, has reached record levels, and the rate is increasing. And what that's meant is that Palm Springs in 2019 became one of the fastest growing airports in the peer set. What I mean by peer set is we look at West Coast airports with between 50% and 200% of Palm Springs International Airport's seat capacity. And you can see there that of those West Coast airports, we're the second fastest growing airport, faster than other airports which people often talk about in our sort of catchment, in our sort of competitor set. And that's a real accolade, I think, to Palm Springs and the destination and the airport in terms of accommodating that level of growth. And you can see there, if you look at it on a continental basis, if you compare us across the entire, all of North America, you can see that we have grown, particularly over the last 2 years, well above what the rest of North America has done in terms of air service growth.
So could I ask you, what would be the reason for that?
There's a couple of reasons for that. One is the appeal of this destination. So there's been a huge change from what airlines have told us, a huge change in the perception of Palm Springs among travellers. Previously, Palm Springs was seen as predominantly a drive destination for people in Southern California. Increasingly, its appeal is spreading out towards the East Coast and Midwest.
And what have you found is the reason for that appeal?
Look, I'm gonna leave that to the experts who can tell me why people want to come to Palm Springs. But if you had to ask me anecdotally what's driving the growth and interest in the valley, I'd say a couple of things. There's a great festival that's happening in a couple of months in your part of the world down in Coachella, which has driven a huge amount of awareness of the destination in a younger demographic. That's one part of it. There's been a huge amount of development of new accommodation products from downtown Palm Springs and throughout the valley. And I think also, dare I say it, there's been a bit of an Instagram moment, which is that Palm Springs happened to be an incredibly Instagrammable place right at the time, of the valley I should say, not just Palm Springs, because you've got everything from Joshua Tree up to Idlewild, but at a time when Instagram suddenly became the big thing, Palm Springs happened to have mid-century modern architecture and great colours and all sorts of things that people just had to get on their ground. So I think there's a couple of things going on, but I'm going to let the experts of the marketing organisation tell me why it's so successful.
I was going to say, good marketing on the part of CBB as well.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And Palm Springs tourism growth.
Yep, exactly.
And so, I mean, what people often say to me is, well, that's a great story, Ollie, but what's happening here? Why is this flatlining and coming down? Well, we're going to talk about that today. I mean, the thing to bear in mind is, even if it is flatlining and coming down, it is still way above where North America is as a whole. So we can't expect that this is going to go on forever. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is what is sustainable growth. Because one of the things we're seeing is that sometimes airlines can get so excited about Palm Springs that they all rush in at the same time, and then nobody can fill seats. So we'll come to that. So if we have a look at what happened in 2019, you can see here that every single one of our carriers, except for 2, grew their capacity in Palm Springs, led by United, and our biggest carrier, which I hope you all know, which is Alaska. Our second biggest growth came from them. Now, only 2 carriers went backwards in 2019. Frontier, which has had a lot of changes in terms of its operating model and how it operates as an airline, and WestJet, which has really suffered from the 737 MAX issue. And the 737 MAX issue, which you might have heard about through the media, is a real cause of concern for a lot of people in this industry, but particularly for markets like Palm Springs, which rely on a number of airlines which have large 737 MAX fleets. 737 MAX, when it came out, was almost the perfect aircraft for somewhere like Palm Springs. It could fly a really long way, it could fly people at really low cost, and it could fly people in smaller to medium-sized aircraft, which previously weren't possible. So all of a sudden, you could now fly people from places like Montreal and New York City and Boston to places like Palm Springs without any sort of payload restriction in both directions, at about 30% lower cost than what had previously been done. So it was, and those economics didn't really work on shorter sectors, but the economics, the value of those economics really presented themselves in long sectors over about 4 hours. So Palm Springs to the east coast was in a really sweet spot for these 737 MAX aircraft. So carriers like WestJet, Air Canada, JetBlue, well they didn't order them, but American Airlines, United, those carriers all saw the value of the 737 MAX and saw the value of those aircraft for places like Palm Springs. Unfortunately, as those aircraft have been grounded, we've also been one of the hardest hit markets in terms of where they can find those aircraft. What's happened in Palm Springs is a lot of carriers have reallocated their fleets to different aircraft types. So we're seeing different aircraft coming into Palm Springs than would have come in with the 737 MAXs. The positive spin on all of that is that when the 737 MAXs do come back, and please don't ask me when that's going to happen, because if I did know that, I'd buy a lottery ticket. When they do come back, we're also in a great position to grow again and to capture a lot of that growth. What we also saw in 2019 were 3 new routes. We saw Boston from JetBlue, we saw Payne Field from Alaska, which is an airport to the north of Seattle, and we saw Sacramento. So Paul, you said you do a lot of work in Sacramento, so now we have a non-stop flight to Sacramento, the state capital. So we're not resting there. We want to see more of those sorts of things. We want to see this community and these cities linked better to the rest of the country and the world. Until October, we saw 26 months of consecutive passenger growth at the airport. That's an incredible record. I don't think I've ever seen a market in the United States which had that long and unbroken period of growth. In November, we saw a backwards trend. We'll come to that, why that happened in a second. But 26 months of unbroken growth up to October 2019 is an incredible run. And just goes to show just how strongly this airport has performed. One thing that I found really surprising in 2019 was to see that Seattle overtook the Bay Area as our #1 air service market. And that goes to show, I think, a number of things. One is that this market is constantly changing, and the dynamics of this market are very, very interesting. And that we can't always assume that just because we think something is true, it's always going to be that way. But in the case of Seattle, we can see that the wealth in that market and the growth in that market has really spurred demand into Palm Springs. And that's why we see people like Alaska looking to add new markets in the Seattle metro area to Palm Springs like Payne Field. So it's really interesting when you think about the Pacific Northwest now, that we now have Portland, Seattle, Payne Field, Bellingham and Vancouver, Canada, 5 cities in the Pacific Northwest, all linked on a non-stop basis to Palm Springs. And the Bay Area, which is absolutely no slouch in terms of economic performance, continues to grow very, very strongly. One thing that we'll be looking at, bless you, in the Bay Area, bless you, how do we go about diversifying our portfolio in the Bay Area? We've started by looking at new flights to Sacramento, but we want to continue that trend and look at markets like San Jose and Oakland to make sure that in the Bay Area we do what we've done in the Pacific Northwest, which is spread our presence across 5 markets in the Pacific Northwest and spread that same sort of coverage to the Bay Area as well. So the question is, with this incredible story of growth, how much further can it go? Well, this winter, we'll actually see fewer seats than we saw the previous winter. Come summertime, that number will stabilise again. And I suspect there's more risk on the upside in terms of growth than there is on the downside. So the current best guess estimate is that the 737 MAXs will come back sometime towards the end of quarter 1 and the beginning of quarter 2, which will mean that come summertime, I expect those summer numbers to go up even further. So at the moment, we're looking at a flat summer. I expect that summer may just be above positive last year. The question is, why has this happened? 2 things happened. In 2018, we grew too fast. So you saw a huge amount of growth on the East Coast. We saw new flights from Delta to Atlanta. We saw Boston come on stream. We saw United launch Newark. We saw nearly an 80% growth in both the Chicago and New York markets in terms of capacity. And the reality was, our market didn't grow 80%. So you can do the math when you say, well, if the seats are growing at 80% and the passenger numbers aren't growing at 80%, somebody's hurting. And unfortunately, those are the people that were hurting with the airlines. 737 MAX grounding has not helped. And what that has actually traditionally meant in this market is that we've had smaller aircraft. So anybody who's flown to Chicago recently probably knows that you've been sitting on a very small aircraft on a 3 or 4 hour flight. And that's because that's the only aircraft that are available within the United fleet and the American fleet at the moment, is those smaller 75 to 100 seat aircraft. So we're seeing smaller aircraft being dedicated to Palm Springs. And what that means over winter this year is we're expecting 7% fewer seats than we saw in the previous year. But that's not a huge problem. So I'll show you this. What we saw in winter over the last 5 years is this. So we saw relatively, like a nice steady growth from 2015, 2016 through 2017, 2018 winter. Then come 2018, 2019, we saw a 21% jump in seat capacity in winter. So you can see that it jumped out of the normal market performance in terms of growth. And at the same time, you can see in these boxes here what happened to airline load factors. So when airlines were growing moderately in this market, and when I say moderately, that was still 8%, when they were growing at 8% a year, they were doing it in a way that their load factors kept up pace. In fact, their load factors actually got better and better. So every single year, even though they added capacity, the performance improved in terms of how many seats they were selling. What happened in 2018, 2019 was they jumped 21% in capacity, and look what happened to load factors. Load factors dropped down to below where they were in 2015. So all of a sudden, they were all looked at each other and they said, this year we added way too much capacity because we all heard. So that's what they saw in 2018, 2019. And come 2019, 2020, what they've decided to do is sort of split the difference and come in somewhere between where they were in 2017, 2018 and 2018, 2019. And so hopefully what we'll see is a return to those above 80% load factors this winter, which is what the airlines want to see. That's how they make money. That's how they ensure that the seats on board are well filled at the right prices. When they're sitting at 78% load factors, they start worrying that that's below the industry average and Palm Springs is underperforming. It's not Palm Springs is underperforming as much as it is that there's just too much capacity all at once. So when we talk about the 737 MAX, the important thing to remember is that a number of our carriers, and I've highlighted in red here the carriers that fly into Palm Springs, a number of our carriers have a large fleet of 737 MAX aircraft. And the problem that we've had is that these aircraft constantly sit on the ground and nobody really knows when they're going to be allowed back in the air again. And that's caused a whole lot of consternation from the airlines. Initially, when they were first grounded, airlines took them out of their schedule for that scheduling period, and they were coming back. So people said to me, well, why did we think 6 months ago that this winter was actually going to be a boom winter? And why did we think that 2 months ago we thought next summer was going to be a boom summer? The issue is that these 737 MAXs are in the schedule, and then the longer the FAA takes to approve these aircraft going back in the air, the airlines have to take them back out of the schedule. So all of a sudden, we see this chunk of air capacity coming out of the schedules all of a sudden. And so that means for a market like ours, looking forward, it's very difficult to forecast what's going to happen in terms of capacity. No, that's not satisfactory. I don't think it's satisfactory. But it's the reality of the 737 MAX ground. As soon as those aircraft come back and that problem is solved, hopefully we'll have much more certainty over our future. But this is the same uncertainty that the airlines are facing. United, American, Delta, well, not so much Delta, but United and American don't have certainty in terms of how much capacity their aircraft, their fleet will have in the coming summer. So you can imagine how that flows through to markets like ours. So what are we looking forward to in 2020? So there's 4 big areas of focus for us as we work with the CBB and Palm Springs International Airport to grow capacity into this region. Number one, and probably the most important thing, it's not sexy, it's not necessarily going to get media headlines, but the most important thing that we can do for this market is to strengthen your year-round air access. One of the challenges in this market is that airlines love it, but they love it in winter. That's not what's ultimately going to make this destination a success on a year-round basis. Airlines need to be able to fill their seats throughout the summer as well, because if they have to find a home for those aircraft in summer, that sometimes is just too difficult. So what they end up doing is they say, well, I'd rather do a year-round market, even if it's slightly worse performing, than a seasonal market. We don't want to remain a seasonal market from an airline's perspective. So we're going to try and looking at how do we strengthen our year-round portfolio of airlines? How do we show the airlines that this is a great place to come throughout the season, in the summertime as well as the wintertime? And that's going to be a big driver of our focus in 2020. The next one, which probably does grab more headlines, is securing new markets. Our focus in 2020 are 3 areas. Which
Could I go back? So
Yep.
do you have an answer for the first question on a year round?
Are we going to do it? Yes.
But how?
How are we going to do it? That's a great question.
Or is that on the next slide? I don't get ahead of you. I just want to make sure we cover that question.
Oh, look, I mean, the how we do it is the fascinating part. Look, I don't know how much time do we have, Tom?
Well, that's the most important question. Noting that in about 2000, early 2000s, we used to have to pay American Airlines $200,000 a year to have one flight a day to Dallas.
Yeah.
So,
And you know what the funny thing about the Dallas flight is that is the most successful flight that American Airlines has here. And the most successful time of the year they operate is the summertime, because they have it to themselves. And it's that story that we are in the process of telling other airlines. So this is a public forum, so I've got to be a little bit careful about the conversations that we're having with specific airlines.
correct.
But there are a number of airlines which have expressed a high amount of interest in operating here, sometimes exclusively in the summer for some airlines. One of the challenges I think you'll probably find is that, well, actually I'll go back a step. I often get the question, why do we have so few ultra low cost carriers in Palm Springs?
So if you want.
Ultra low cost carriers. So why don't we have more Spirits? Why don't we have more Allegiant? Why don't we have more Frontier? Why is it so expensive to fly to Palm Springs? That's what I often hear. And one of the challenges is that it's not just the airfare, but when people want to come to Palm Springs in the wintertime, that's also the peak time for accommodation. So hotel rooms are expensive. So if you're a Spirit customer and you're used to paying $59 to fly to Fort Lauderdale, and then you fly to Palm Springs and the average hotel room is $300 a night, Spirit goes, that's not our customer. Our customers don't pay $300 a night on average for their accommodation. So there are airlines out there that look at the wintertime and say, that's not really the type of market that we go into. However, you take that same customer and you say, what about if we made that $100 a night average, or $150 a night average, or we showed you other parts of the valley which don't have $300 a night accommodation? All of a sudden, airlines like Spirit, Allegiant, Frontier go, maybe this is a year-round market. Maybe we can make a case for this, operating this in summertime.
But doesn't Fort Lauderdale have the same problem in the wintertime?
It does, but it has a lot more accommodation. It's a lot cheaper.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that South Florida has been incredibly successful about, which is just building tremendous amounts of accommodation that cater to all levels, from the high end to the very, very, very low end. I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that the solution is that you build 500 Motel 6s in the valley. I don't think that's what anybody wants. But I am suggesting that there are perceptions out there about this market being very expensive that we have to challenge.
We also have very affordable vacational rentals.
Absolutely.
So that makes an advantage for us, and we're very welcoming.
Exactly.
During the season, they're very expensive as well.
The other challenge we have, it's not so much a challenge as an opportunity, I think, but being on the West Coast, we don't have the same population bases that the East Coast has. Like, we do not have 200 million people located within 3 hours flight of us. So what that means is that our flights are longer, typically if you want to access some of those big population centers on the East Coast. And that means that we have to make a stronger case to the low-cost carriers as to why it's worth operating their plane on a 4-hour sector when they could operate on 2 hour sectors. So we have to make a strong case for that. But it's not just the low-cost carriers. The American example is a great one of saying there are opportunities for carriers to operate through the summer and do extremely well. American has proven that. It's taking that story and operating it through other carriers. We know WestJet has operated Canadian cities through the summer and has done extremely well. Taking that story to Canada or other Canadian carriers is a key part of that. And it's also identifying which markets, particularly in the Midwest, make sense for us on a year-round basis. It's probably no secret that our number one focus in terms of getting that year-round service is Chicago. We see getting the Chicago year-round service as absolutely critical as a next step. But the how and what we're saying to each carriers, I'll have a private conversation with you afterwards.
Thank you.
We also have to take into account all the international clients that we have in tourist, and unfortunately, most of them would not fly nonstop to here. It would be a connection issue. So attracting that and taking that into consideration is also important.
That's a fantastic point, because a lot of our European visitors, for instance, prefer to come here in the summertime.
Yeah, taking advantage of U.S. pre-clearing airports, that will be a very great benefit.
And so there are huge opportunities for us in the summertime. We have great accommodation providers who are prepared to discount their rates to try to target a new customer market. I think a great tourism proposition. One of the things we did that we wanted to do first up when we started working with GPS CBB was we started bringing airline network planners to the valley in summertime to say, you know what, this isn't what you think it is. It is not some sort of blast furnace where you're going to hate your life. Coming here in the middle of summertime, like I brought United's network planning team down here in July for July 4th. They loved it. It said, this city knows how to deal with the heat. But there's a perception out there about what Palm Springs is and what the valley is that is completely different to what the reality is. And sometimes the only way you can change that is to bring these people who live in their ivory towers to the valley.
And our hotel rates come way down in the summertime,
Exactly.
which makes it very attractive for Europeans.
Exactly. And you know, a lot of our European visitors don't mind 100-degree heat. They're used to that. I mean, think about the Germans and British. They all fly to southern Italy and southern Spain and Greece in the middle of summer. Like if they were worried about the heat, they'd be heading north. But one of the challenges about that is that those European markets, the way they get to the United States is typically through East Coast gateways. And we don't have flights to the East Coast in summertime. So that's one of the big challenges. So our third one, which is a little bit difficult to see on this screen, which is the green one, which says new models for diversifying access. And what we mean by that is that we recognise that we have a very legacy carrier-driven airport at the moment, which is a great thing. But Tom's also done a fantastic job in keeping this airport low cost. So it's funny to see a market mix of relatively high-cost airlines and a relatively low-cost airport. And the question we have is going to some of these things that Peter was talking about in terms of accommodation providers that are willing to discount and drop their rates. How do we tailor that to the airline mix that we could have in this market? And so we're looking at different airline models to make sure that works. An example of that, a different airline model, and when I say different airline models, everyone instantly thinks, oh, you mean Spirit and Southwest. I do mean those, but I also mean the likes of Contour. So we brought Contour in here last year because they were a great model for people, for business travellers, for instance, and commuters who need to get to the state capital in Sacramento. So those sorts of models change the way people think about Palm Springs and how they use this airport. If people can look at this airport not just as an expensive airport for high-cost carriers, but also as a commuter airport to get to the state capital, as well as a leisure airport for people to fly out of Palm Springs who live here, as well as people who may have otherwise wanted to come to Palm Springs in the valley, but have found it too expensive. Those are all the different market segments that we want to make sure are catered for through the airport. And finally, and probably the most controversial point, is number 4, which is international exposure. When I say international exposure, I do not necessarily mean non-stop international flights into Palm Springs International Airport. So before anybody starts getting heart palpitations about British Airways landing A380s in Palm Springs, that's not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is a bit like what we were talking about before. How do we make sure that European visitors who come here in the summertime find it easier to get here? We know that this is an internationally recognised destination with a huge amount of international appeal, but we do not have international flights beyond Canada at the moment. How do we use our gateways in San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver, Toronto, and New York and Chicago, and Dallas to some extent? How do we use those gateways most effectively to ensure that people who are coming from our international source markets can reach the valley as easily as possible? What we do not want to have is a situation whereby people say, it's too difficult to get to the valley, I'll go somewhere else like Phoenix. And the same with people who fly to Southern California. I fly to Southern California, but I don't want to do a 3-hour plus drive through Southern California traffic to get to Palm Springs. Those are the sorts of inhibitors and roadblocks that we do not want to encounter in this market. So we want to look at other ways of getting those people in here to make sure that we do not see people turning off the valley because it's too difficult to get here. And our overall goal and our overall mantra is sustainable year-round access to the greater Palm Springs region. It's not just about the sugar hits of, hey, this winter we're getting this many new flights. It's about making sure it's sustainable and year-round. That's how you're going to have a great air service market. It's going to make sure that the destination is well served. People can move here and live here, have great business careers here, and operate their businesses from Palm Springs in the valley on a year-round basis. It's going to mean that we ensure that our accommodation providers are filled not just through the peak winter season, but also through the summer season as well. And it's going to ensure that we as a community are recognised as airlines as a year-round destination, not just as a place to throw your planes in the wintertime.
Let me ask a quick question.
Of course.
When you go back to the international exposure, isn't it primarily, since we have legacy carriers, focus on their alliances? One World with American and Star Alliance with you?
Definitely. Absolutely. So what are the key enablers to ensure that we get these things to happen? First of all, it's about pursuing the right opportunities. One of the biggest mistakes that people can make is to have a scattergun approach, saying we will take all comers. Because what happens is that we go and do that, and then those routes will fall over, and then the airlines will say, oh, that didn't work, we're never trying Palm Springs again. So it's really important that we pursue the right opportunities on a data-driven approach. Yeah.
So to that point, I kind of feel like the New York market, which we're going to talk about in our marketing meeting, is right in that spot that you're talking about. In your 4 priorities, I didn't really see a category for strengthening emerging or accelerating markets of importance
Yep.
to us.
Look, if I go back to this step, I think that New York is a great example of actually category number 1, which is strengthening our year-round access. So what we're trying to do in markets like New York is an existing market for us, right? It's not an existing year-round market, but it's an existing seasonal market. What we're trying to do in markets like New York is to strengthen that market so that it gets to a year-round service, right? We don't necessarily think that the way to solve New York is just to throw more and more and more and more and more attention at the winter period. And the reason for that is that the people in New York particularly have plenty of alternative approaches in the winter season. They've got markets which are located much more closely to them, which offer a very similar product from a warmth perspective, sun perspective, if you want to put it that way.
I'd like to take that conversation offline.
Of course.
Offline.
Of course.
Thank you.
But I will say that in the case of New York, one of the things you're right about saying is that that was a case where too much capacity went in all at once. And one of the challenges we have going forward is in an environment where airlines have to make independent decisions because they're not allowed to talk to each other. They can't say, well, you do New York this year and we'll do Chicago. I wish they could, make my life a lot easier. Instead, they all look at the same information in 2017 and say, wow, the New York market to Palm Springs is booming. JetBlue goes, we're going to launch new services. United goes, we're going to launch new services. And all of a sudden, we sit here in Palm Springs and go, we've got 78% more seats in New York this year. And then people say, oh, Chicago's also doing well. Let's throw more capacity in Chicago. Oh, Atlanta, let's do that as well. And Boston, what about a non-stop from Boston? And so they all make these independent decisions. And then GPS CBB and Palm Springs International Airport has this wonderful job of saying, uh-oh, this winter we've got 80% more seats from the East Coast. What are we going to do to drive that demand? And as you probably know, growing a market doesn't happen in one season. It's a long-term market development exercise. But great question. So the pursuit of the right opportunities means that we have to go out there and talk to the carriers about which markets we want. And so oftentimes when we sit down with an airline, airlines will say, what is it that Palm Springs wants? And that's not just a Palm Springs question. They ask that about any market we represent. They say, what is it that is particularly relevant? Because what they don't like is when markets come to them and say, we'll like this shopping list of opportunities. Because the airline turns around and says, you're not getting all of that. You're not going to get a flight to London, a flight to New York, a flight to Palm Springs, and a flight to Johannesburg at the same time. Which one do you want most? And our job is to say which of those opportunities makes most sense for the market and for the airline involved. And the second sort of rubric around this is how do we support services most effectively? And Tom sort of mentioned earlier today when he said the reason why GPS CBB works with the service consultant is that GPS CBB isn't shackled by the FAA, isn't restricted in what it can do and how it works with airlines. And it means that they can have an incredibly effective partnership with the airport because the airport can do many of the traditional things that airlines expect. And the GPS CBB can do the unorthodox, untraditional things that make the airlines sit up and listen and say, wow, that's really cool. We really like that. Most destinations can't do that. So that partnership between the GPS CBB and the airport ensures that this market has an incredible toolkit of responses to airline opportunities. We can talk about some of those opportunities in a second. And the final thing is making sure that we build the market's appeal. So airlines need multi-segment appeal in order to make a destination work. One of the mistakes that a lot of destinations do, and you can understand why they do it, is they say something's worked really well for a very long time. Selling mid-century modern art to the world and saying come to Palm Springs to sit in a boutique hotel, go to a spa and see mid-century modern art, that works really well. There's no question about that. But that isn't going to fill planes, and certainly not going to fill planes on a year-round basis. Airlines say, that's nice, but tell me about your business market. That's nice, but tell me about your convention traffic. That's nice, but tell me about who's moving to Palm Springs and second home ownership. Because all of those components of demand also fill planes. And one of the things we're increasingly hearing from airlines is, that's nice, but tell us about who and why people are moving and choosing to live in Palm Springs. And that's why we get involved in things like economic development and business development in Palm Springs. Who is moving into the valley? Why are they moving into the valley? What's driving business growth and what's holding business growth back? One of the things we often hear is that people from the Bay Area don't want to pay Bay Area prices. They want to live in the Valley because it's better weather, a much better lifestyle, and better cost of living. But in order to run their businesses as high-level tech consultants or whatever it might be, they need to be able to get to their markets. That market might be New York, it might be Chicago, it might be the Bay Area. Without those flights, they can't effectively relocate to Palm Springs. So we see air access as enabling and also driving economic development in the Valley from those perspectives. And airlines want to know about that. They want to know how you're going to fill first class as well as basic economy. And so those sorts of components of demand are absolutely critical in terms of how we grow the air access in the Valley. And that's it. So.
Wonderful.
So you mentioned before the issue that we talked about during the season. I'm of course particularly interested in the month of March.
Yep.
And because of our event and what we're running into now, I'm trying to grow the event obviously, and our goal is to grow to beyond 500,000 spectators, which translates into about 200,000 unique visitors. And our future growth is endangered basically through two things. One is air access, and number two is what was mentioned, the issue of the high hotel rates, which I'm dealing with the hotels. And fortunately, and that's a good sign, is we do get new hotel inventory being built in the medium range classes, fortunately. But even there, you can see like Homewood Suites, so charges $500 a night when it normally would charge $150, whatever, during the season. So my question is do you do leakage studies on a regular basis? And if so, for the month of March in particular, is there much more of a leakage, or is our growth really stunted because people do not get to the Valley?
It's a great question. So my favorite word in this industry is leakage because it means it's something different to everybody. When I hear leakage, I say, from Palm Springs International Airport's perspective, how many people are coming to the Valley that don't use PSP? That's what I understand by leakage. Or alternatively, how many people in the Valley drive to another airport outside of the Valley to fly? So for instance, they drive to Ontario, they drive to LAX to fly out. Or vice versa, visitors coming in, they fly to LAX or Ontario. So I just want to make sure, when you say leakage, is that
leakage is Ontario in particular, because of easier access than LAX. And is there noticeable leakage to that airport? I mean, that Ontario is growing again over the last couple of years. So that would be, and that obviously might help in convincing airlines that even though because of those numbers that you showed, I can see where it goes down to 77% load factor, yeah, they're concerned, but it doesn't help.
So when it comes to leakage, you're absolutely right. Domestically, our biggest leakage airport is Ontario. And internationally, our biggest leakage airport is LAX. And so we see those as both opportunities in terms of how do we convert people from flying direct, as well as enablers in terms of the fact that they provide additional air capacity into the region that we currently can't accept. So for instance, we cannot get Australians flying non-stop into Palm Springs, as much as we'd like them to. We don't have a CBP facility, we don't have the airlines that want to do it. What that means is that LAX is our gateway for Australian visitors who want to come to Palm Springs. And so how do we make it easier for people to get from LAX to Palm Springs is a critical component of that. As I said, I don't think air access or even hotel accommodation are the only two inhibitors of people who want to get here. One of the things I regularly hear is people who go to LAX, how do I get to Palm Springs if they don't want to rent a car? I mean, those are the sorts of enablers that we need to overcome in terms of making sure that this remains an accessible destination. It's really interesting. We did a big study in the Bay Area around Ontario in terms of understanding how many people in the Bay Area actually leak to Ontario because either they can't get a non-stop flight from their preferred airport in San Jose or Oakland, or alternatively they really want to fly Southwest. So those were the two big drivers of why people did. And we found that there was some degree of that and some elements of that, because if you think about it, if you live in the Bay Area, there's no point in taking a connecting flight over Phoenix to get from San Jose or Oakland to Palm Springs. Nobody does that. They're either going to drive to SFO and take a non-stop, or they're going to fly to Ontario and drive over. So we did see that as a big leakage opportunity in the Bay Area. And that's probably the number one thing that we're trying to address, and that's why Oakland and San Jose are high priority targets for us. Finding airlines that want to do that is critical. I suppose no one's asked me about when are we getting Southwest yet?
We've been taught by Tom not to ask those questions.
Thank you, Tom.
Other questions for all of? No?
Great.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Thank you. It's very, very helpful, very instructive. It's Tom, any other introductions and presentations?
No, sir.
Okay, we go to the city manager report. David?
Well, sure. Good morning, everyone. I would just note a couple of things. It looks like January 22nd is the day that we're going to have scheduled for the marketing position. We have the recruiter and I believe Ralph, you and Ralph
Ralph and myself.
Okay, so that's what we're trying to finalize that date, on the 22nd. With regard to the position, the other position that Steve Bowser, I guess those interviews are ready for you to go, Tom, when we get those scheduled, then you have candidates. The only other thing, the third position, the engineering position, we got one candidate who really wasn't qualified, so we're continuing to recruit. Now, as Bill said, this is what, getting hired qualified people in the desert is what I call the sand curtain. We've always had that issue, it's getting a little better than it used to be. So we're going to continue that recruitment. However, we may have to look at some alternatives. So by the time we get to the next meeting, we'll have a better handle on what we're going to do there. So those are the positions that we're doing on the recruitments. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned with regard to council changed their meetings to Thursday nights. That really won't affect this. However, so for example, there's a council meeting tomorrow. The agenda is done the week before. So anything you do here would go to the following agenda, so I don't see that being an issue.
Good, thank you. All right, that's it.
Okay. Happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. On the change of meeting times for boards and commissions, first reading of that ordinance is tomorrow night. When do you expect the second reading to be? Because 30 days afterwards it will be effective, so we can have a discussion about that. What do you expect the effective
That's a
date
good
to be?
point. That is probably the most important thing that's occurring that will affect you. So council is going to mandate that boards and commissions be at start no later than earlier than 5:30. Earlier than 5:30. No earlier than 5:30. Just so at that point, then they can have more participation from the community, people who work. So that's where they're going to have the discussion, first reading on Thursday. Second reading will be the following meeting 2 weeks later. Actually, we have an extra week. The second meeting won't be until the 30th of January, and then start 30 days after that.
What would be the implementation schedule?
Well, again, that's going to be, there's going to be some lead time. We realize that some commissions it's going to be easier to do that than others. This one, I suspect, may be a little more problematic. So I think potentially what we should do at a minimum, Mr. Chairman, is agendize this for your next meeting, have a discussion, get some input, and if, I'm sure council will be flexible on the implementation. So that's sort of where we are.
What that would require is if in fact we are required to start no earlier than 5:30, is to decide at what time do we want to begin. Do we want to begin at 5:30, begin at 6, begin at 7, there are the discussions. So. It's the same. But yes, it needs to be on the agenda for the next.
Okay. So
Tom, if we would be sure to add that. Okay. Any other reports you have, David? Any other questions for David? No? All right. Into the budget and finance report.
Mark. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. As you can see before you, we have the financial report, and just to kind of tag along what Oliver had to say, going through our revenue streams, we have 4 primary accounts, and on page 1 we have the customer facility charge, which is collected from the rental cars, and looking at that on the surface, it would appear that those revenues are down. But just to remind the group that the reports for December are still not in. We have various things to post. Most of the reports are not due until the 10th of the month. So we expect the car rental reports to be in by the 10th. We expect airline reports to be in by the 10th. So some of these categories still have revenues that will be posted to December. So with that, we would expect the CFCs to be up like the other categories. Passenger facility charges compared to last year up 13%. which track very closely with our passenger growth. And the passenger growth here drives so many things on our revenue stream. Looking at the next category, our M&O budget up 18% compared to last year. So again, you can see the importance of the continued passenger growth and how that impacts our availability of revenue. Along with and the last category is the Fund 416, which those funds are collected strictly from FAA grants. Those grants this year are being split. The revenue's also coming from our PFC for our terminal wing project. So we have not yet expended as much money as prior years, but that fund is tracking along just as we had budgeted and scheduled. Moving to the last page, just to take a look at the fund balances, page 3 at the middle to the bottom of the page. Funds are growing compared to last year and compared to last month. CFC funds continue to grow as we get into the car rental project, and the planning for that continues. We'll have more to come in the near months. The PFC fund continues to grow as well, as we now only have one consolidated CFC expense for the new bonds that we issued last year, and other funds tracking similarly. The M&O funds at the bottom, Fund 415. Last year at this time we had a fund balance of about $2.5 million. This year we have over $5 million, so all of our revenues are very strong, and that really concludes the financial report.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think it's an appropriate time to mention financially speaking, and it somewhat ties into the whole scenario of air service. At 10 o'clock today, we're having a meeting with airline partners to continue the discussions about a new airline agreement. And it's evidence, we've actually done a 5-year projection. Costs are going up at the airport. It's inevitable. With rising costs of the California retirement obligation, cogeneration, a very aggressive capital improvement program, the addition of an engineer, the addition of an air service person, etc. The costs of operating this airport are continuing to climb, and so will the CPE. The good news is we're starting at a very low baseline, but inevitably we have to grow in order to function the airport. So that is a factor in the negotiations, and we certainly want to temper that the best we can. So.
Any questions for Mark? Tom? Budget? All right, we move into item 11. Tom?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. What we're going to be doing from here on until our robust conglomeration of projects ends, we are going to provide an update on the projects and show you the actual schedules as presented by our professionals. The most
You're going to do it monthly, that was the...
We're going to do it monthly, that is correct. Conrad Gensler is on board. We're doing the design. This is the conceptual and the schematic phase. We've collected a lot of data, but what we're doing right now is a data collection, and we're soon getting into the programming. As you can see, this is going to extend out to August, so we're right about in this area right here. Very simple. Very simple. A couple other enabling projects in there is a relocation to Customs Border Protection. One of the key factors with that is including the data. We're in heavy discussions with our partners at CBP to determine where that general aviation facility, not the international arrivals facility, where that will go on the airport. We've got a location. We're getting that sanctioned through that. And you can see that's going to extend out with that as well. The USO is in the hangar that needs to be leveled in order to make way for the multi-level parking deck, and we're in discussions with them as well as to what their needs are. So this is a very exciting phase and busy phase as well. Let's look at our ticketing hall. This is a big project. Oliver, when you talk about the low-cost carriers and capacity constraints and everything, we're very excited about this because we're increasing the number of... I didn't do that. Did you? I'm not sure that's where we were. Was it? Okay. Yeah. So what we're doing is increasing the capacity of the ticket counter space. We're introducing shared use rather than build bricks and mortars, and that's very important to a lot of the low-cost airlines. That's a big attractive factor. We're also introducing a state-of-the-art baggage handling system, and all of that is going to make the airport more efficient, more attractive, but that does come with operating costs. By the way, the baggage handling system could probably add about $1 million in operating to be able to manage that in the shared use from a technological oversight standpoint. So where we are right now is back here. A little bit, we're in construction startup. This physical construction won't start until March, where we're going to see a little trickle behind the scenes. Unfortunately, we've got some incompatible material that have to be removed from the site, which wasn't, we weren't sure whether or not it was there. We've done the testing, and that's going to have to occur. So that's going to add some time to the schedule up front. What we're doing now is focusing on the baggage handling system. We're working with a company out of Louisville. There's been nothing but meetings to formulate the work plans for that, modify the original design and come out with a perfect design so they can start manufacturing that. In addition to that, we're working on phasing details with the contractor in order to make sure all these little nuances are worked out as well. So here we are. You can see what's really big about this schedule is we thought we could get it done in one season. It's not going to happen in one season. The good news is by the time December comes, we'll be done with about 85% of the project. If you can envision the ticketing hall, we have the upper level called the north end. That's where the Bronx, I think everybody's familiar with that. And then you step down and go to the newer, lower level. That's where most of the low-cost carriers are. By December, we will have the upper hall complete. That'll have the entire baggage handling system, which represents about $13 million of the $29 million project, and all of the other public space. So that will be turnkey. We'll have all the ticket counters set up, and that'll be gorgeous, beautiful by the end of this year. What will trickle into next year is the lower level, where it really doesn't have much baggage handling system modification other than a leg that ties into the main area, but the remodeling of that. Now we're going to plan for the worst case scenario. Chances are that could go smoother, but we're planning for that. And that's a little difference from the schedule you've seen in the past. Well, okay, here we are. Ulysses is not here. What you see out in the terminal right now are some construction walls and other tarps. We've got 4 elements to that project. The big point is the security area expansion. That should open within about a week, 10 days-ish. I'd love to take you. I've got some photos here. But, oh, there we go. When we were doing the remodel, we discovered this gorgeous. Isn't this wonderful? Mid-century modern, the original wall was covered up years ago. Isn't that beautiful? It needs a little dusting and cleaning up, but it's magnificent. It'll be in that new area. Looking at it from here as you're walking in as a passenger, this wall will be gone to the left as a screening area. You can see the extra space that we have. The operations center used to be right there. Last meeting I showed you a big hole in the middle of that. That is now covered up. And so we're right there. This is the brand new gate that has to go down at night, the security area. Very nice. Now, if you look at the Celebrity Bistro, we consumed a chunk of that to put the new police office back there. And that's going to have great access for them on the air side and the land side, and they have direct sight of that checkpoint. So don't mess with us at the checkpoint. It's going to be strategic. So here's the inside. Nothing gargantuan, but it got separate offices to store lost and found. We do have new canine operations, so that'll be helpful there, and there's some administrative space. Looking out in front of the building to help with the car rental, we're relocating one of the doors over about 15 feet. The bad news about that thing is the manufacturers are telling us that lead time on the automatic doors is out of sight, out of mind. What's happening out in the industry, those of you that are involved in construction, it's a busy economy, and to get parts on everything takes an act of God. It's incredible. So that surprised everybody, including contractor. You can see it parted off on the inside, and but we're moving ahead. Now, when this is all said and done...
So Tom,
yes.
What is the date for the doors then? Do we have a date?
We do have a date. We're working on that.
So
We're talking February-ish, unfortunately.
This February, next month?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not good for us. We wanted it sooner, so we're going to go to Plan B. We'll probably go to Ontario and maybe at 2 in the morning. Right? They're competitors anyway. So with that being said, Mr. Chairman, there's a brief update. We'll give that every month unless something extraordinary happens. If anybody has a new automatic door, Rob, do you have something?
We don't do automatic. So we're going to have this presentation monthly to keep us all informed of the capital project moving forward, which is going to be extremely helpful.
It is.
Any questions for Tom before we move forward? This was just for discussion. We had no action on this one. So now we move to the executive director and staff reports. Tom, you're on again.
Okay, so other projects going on, the passenger boarding bridge project, we're still developing the specifications on that. You may recall that part of the governor's action several months ago was to put airports on alert that they had to do an analysis of the potential infiltration of PFAS, it's calling. There's a movie out on PFAS right now. If you haven't seen it, I think it's even on Netflix, in theater as well. But all industries are affected by it, and we're working toward that. We're going to be doing a significant analysis of our water wells to see if any, what if any, because of the aircraft rescue and firefighting foam. Do you remember me describing that previously?
Yes.
We don't think there'll be a big issue, but airports are required to comply with that. Aircraft rescue and firefighting truck acquisition, that's in procurement right now. That will eventually get out to bid and to facilitate the acquisition of that. Part of the ACIP as well, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, was the runway sweeper vacuum truck. That is going to be developed and forwarded for a bid process as well. Airline use and lease agreement, I discussed that earlier. Concessions RFP, we are diligently working that. There's been some traction that's been discussed about phase one. We're going to focus on getting out on the street with phase one. The consultant is working that, and we hope to have something in February with that from the consultant, get out on the street. The parking RFP has already been submitted. A separate committee is reviewing the results of that. I'm not on that, but it's being reviewed, and that should be a determination over the next several weeks. Advertising concession, we're looking at an extension. This will probably be brought to the commission next meeting when we have some details on what type of arrangement the extension would result in for a better program. The car rental agreements are expiring sooner than not, and we're going to have to extend those, obviously, in accordance and to time it with the nuances of the new facility. That concludes my report.
Thank you, Tom. Any questions of Tom?
The advertising, is that an existing contract that gets amended, or is it a new contract? Or?
No, it is an existing contract. That term is up shortly, and we are looking into extending that, keeping the existing equipment, and then making an investment to have continuity and to move it forward.
All right, then we're going to move on to the commissioner requests and reports. We're going to start with Jan to report on the operations committee.
Yeah, the operations committee got together yesterday, and we had one subject in front of us, and that was Customs and Border Control Facility. It sounds like a simple thing to take a look at, but what we were looking at really, it's really very appropriate that Oliver was here today on air service, was the potential for international air service, whether that's coming from Europe or Mexico or wherever. We simply don't have the facilities at this airport to accommodate such international traffic, should it ever be realized. So, we took a look at a couple of different ways of approaching this, and we think it's probably long-term. If there's something established on an international basis, it would be rather long-term. But is there something that we could potentially look at in terms of accommodating international traffic with existing facilities, for example, the regional concourse, and doing a bit of cross-utilization. So we did have a motion on the table that was passed unanimously to have Gensler's scope for the CONRAC modified slightly to take a look at the potential for cross-utilization, probably specifically with the regional concourse. We're an international airport, but we're international because we have pre-clearance out of Canada. In Europe, there's pre-clearance out of Shannon and Dublin. You can go all the way back to Abu Dhabi if you want pre-clearance. There's no pre-clearance out of Mexico. There's more pre-clearance down the road. For example, Stockholm has been approved for pre-clearance, but it's not quite up yet. So if there were flights in from Europe, for example, from a pre-cleared airport, that takes away the problem of CBP. However, That's unlikely to happen soon. So I think everyone around the table was fairly excited about the potential for this. And we'll see where it goes in rescoping Gensler.
And since it was not on the agenda, we can't take any action as a commission today, but it'll be on the agenda for the next meeting. But I wonder, since we have Oliver here, that was a very brief kind of presentation, if you have any observations from the work that you've done. You referenced international a little bit in terms of just overall what you've heard for us to start taking a look.
Sure, do you want to stand up?
Oh, sure. Would you mind?
Look, one thing I'll say is that I think whatever the commission decides, it's important to sort of bear in mind it's not just an infrastructure question. There's a CPP officer question, which we're running into quite seriously.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
So in Southern California, which all sits under the Los Angeles Port Director for CPP, we're facing serious CPP officer shortages. We work with Las Vegas, for instance, and Las Vegas wanted to extend its CPP hours to accommodate flights from South America early in the morning. We couldn't even pay CPP overtime to get those officers in because the Los Angeles Port Director quite rightly said, I don't have any officers to spare. They're all being sent to the southern border at the moment. So one thing I would say is that even if you built another facility here that accommodated long-haul aircraft from pre-cleared airports, we face a second question which no amount of money is really going to solve, which is where do you get the officers from? So it is probably a long-term consideration. I think it's worth continuing conversations with the airlines to understand what level of interest there is out there and from which markets. I would hate for us to go and do this and find out that by the time the airline operates it, it's coming from a pre-cleared airport. There's some talk about, for instance, Heathrow becoming a pre-cleared airport. So I think it's worth studying, it's worth investigating, but it's not just an infrastructure question.
I appreciate it.
No, that's true. It very definitely is air service as well as physical facility.
Right. We'll have this on the agenda. Just a quick question, because we'll have this on the agenda for the next
Well,
meeting.
it's just a comment on the CPB problem, which is, while it's a sort of government bureaucracy problem, it's also a political problem, and there are political solutions. We heard that, agents are being directed to the border. That may not be the case in the same way after the next election, or if it is the case after the next election, there are other people of influence with the Trump administration who are major investors in the Coachella Valley that we can work with. So I think we shouldn't take these as obstacles that cannot be overcome, but as barriers that we can take down.
Well, we're moving forward. We really don't want to get into this level of discussion because it's not on the agenda, but we
I
need
would like to make one comment.
one comment, Peter.
Just to clarify, we have not discussed and we're not discussing building an international facility. We're talking about a mixed state use that we can also use for domestic service.
Right.
So we're not talking about an international facility.
Right, and that's what Jan was referring to, like the regional concourse, where you can have multiple uses of it, and other airports have done. You had a question then?
Yeah, just a question, Oliver, as part of your studies. Can you get information as to the origin of people going out of Mexicali? To identify, the number of people who actually travel across the border, similar to what happens in San Diego, flying out of Tijuana, and because to have that data for service from Mexican carriers, for example, we know that there's a large number of people who travel down to Mexicali, across the border and fly from there, rather than.
And Tijuana as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other one that's very interesting is, so not every Canadian airport is pre-cleared. That's true. And there are significant levels of demand from some Canadian cities that don't have pre-clearance. And so whatever you start, I would recommend having a look at not just Mexico, which is the important part, but also non-pre-cleared Canadian cities.
Okay, that'd be good to do. All right, we will have this on the agenda for detailed discussion and action at the next meeting. Report on council items, I think we've had that.
Everything's in your package?
Yep, that we've done. Any correspondence? No correspondence. The airline activity, airline schedules?
For December,
Still waiting?
Yeah, we're waiting till.
We're always a month behind on that, okay. Then we're down to adjournment, and the marketing committee, as a reminder, will be meeting immediately following this meeting. So is there any motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
If we don't adjourn, we keep meeting. Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, great. Thank you.